There's a clay prism in the Ashmolean Museum that most visitors walk past without a second glance. It's about 8 inches tall, covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks, and it sits behind glass in a dimly lit corner of the ancient Near East collection. But this unassuming artefact contains something extraordinary. It lists 8 kings who ruled the ancient world for a combined total of 241,200 years. The prism was found in 22 in the ruins of an Iraqi city called Larsa, pulled from sand that had buried it for nearly 4,000 years. When scholars finally translated the cuneiform script, they discovered it wasn't recording mythology or poetry, it was documentation, a careful bureaucratic record of royal succession, written in the same matter-of-fact tone ancient scribes used to track grain harvests and tax payments. The scribe who pressed these symbols into wet clay around 1800 BC was copying from even older sources, preserving a king list that claimed to stretch back to the very beginning of human civilization. What makes this remarkable isn't just the impossible ages attributed to these rulers. It's that the same scribes who recorded these millennial reigns also tracked the movements of Venus with precision we wouldn't match until the Renaissance. They calculated mathematical problems using a base 60 system so sophisticated we still use it today every time we read a clock. They weren't primitive, they weren't ignorant, they were meticulous record keepers who understood the difference between history and myth, yet they wrote these numbers down anyway, treated them as fact, and copied them generation after generation for 2,000 years. The list begins with a simple statement, almost casual in its profundity. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not kingship was invented. Not kingship evolved from tribal chieftains. It descended from heaven to a city called Eridu, and there, according to the clay, a king named Alalim ruled for 28,800 years. So tonight, as the weight of your day begins to lift and your thoughts start to slow, I'm going to take you on a journey back to that world, not to solve the mystery of whether these kings actually lived, or whether the Anunnaki were gods or something else entirely, but to explore what the Sumerians themselves believed happened during those impossibly long ages, to walk through the cities they built, to read the tablets they left behind, to understand what they thought was real. Close your eyes if you'd like. You won't need them for this. The world I'm building exists better in darkness, in that space between memory and sleep where ancient history feels more like a half-remembered dream. Let the story unfold at its own pace. There's no rush. We have all night, and we're going back a very, very long way before we drift any deeper into the past. If this resonates with you, a quiet light helps. Others discover these stories. I'm curious too. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? What time is it there as you settle in? Drop a comment if you'd like. The visuals here are just atmosphere. You don't need to watch. This is a journey of words and imagination. Now, let the present fade. Let the familiar dissolve. And let's step backward through time into a world of clay and myth and impossible kings. The desert wind carries dust that's older than nations. Your standing's in southern Iraq, but Iraq doesn't exist yet. Neither does the concept of Iraq. Neither really does the concept of nations as we understand them. The year, if such a measurement meant anything here, would be somewhere around 5400 BC. The last ice age ended 2,000 years ago. The world is warming. The glaciers that covered half of Europe have retreated to memory. And here, where 2 great rivers slice through an otherwise hostile landscape, something unprecedented is beginning to happen. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers don't flow gently here. They flood, violently, unpredictably, sweeping away anything foolish enough to stand in their path. But when the waters recede, they leave behind something precious. Silt, black, fertile, impossibly rich soil that can grow almost anything if you can figure out how to manage the water. Most people, most tribes, most of the scattered bands of humans trying to survive in this harsh world, they follow the herds. They move with the seasons. They live light, mobile, ready to pack up and move whenever resources run thin. But here, at a place that will later be called Eridu, someone made a different choice. They stayed. And in staying, they invented something that would change everything. They invented the city. Eridu rises from virgin sand. Archaeological excavations in the New 40s and 1950s, led by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd, would later confirm what the ancient texts claimed. There was no previous settlement here, no earlier village, no nomadic campsite that gradually evolved into something more permanent. The first structure built at Eridu was a temple. A small one, perhaps 3 meters by 4 meters, made from mud brick. But a temple nonetheless, a house for a god. And around that temple, very deliberately, very intentionally, the first city began to grow. The site we call Tel Abu Shahrain today doesn't look like much. It's a mound, a tell, rising about 7 meters above the surrounding desert. Tells are common in this part of the world. They're artificial hills created over millennia, as generation after generation built new structures on top of the ruins of old ones. But when Safar and Lloyd excavated Eridu, what they found took their breath away. They identified 18 distinct levels of occupation, 18 complete rebuilds of the temple, and the oldest one, at the very bottom, sitting on pure sand with no earlier human activity beneath it, dated to around 5400 BC. That makes Eridu one of the oldest urban settlements ever discovered. Contemporary with, and possibly older than, the earliest levels at Jericho. Older than the first Egyptian cities. Older than anything in China or the Indus Valley. This was the prototype, the blueprint, the first attempt at what we would eventually call civilization. The Sumerians themselves, writing thousands of years later, remembered Eridu as special, sacred, the first city, the place where everything began. Their legend said it was founded by the god Enki, the lord of the Abzu, the freshwater ocean that they believed existed deep beneath the earth. Enki was the god of wisdom, of magic, of fresh water and fertility, and his home, his earthly residence, was here. In a temple complex that would eventually be called the Abzu, the House of the Aquifer, the temple grew with each generation. The second iteration was slightly larger. The third, larger still. By the 16th level, rebuilt during the Uruk period around 3500 BC, the temple had become a massive structure, dwarfing anything else in the region. And then, around 2100 BC, during the third dynasty of Ur, they built the ziggurat, a stepped pyramid of mud brick that towered over the flat Mesopotamian plain. It wasn't finished. The Urtha III dynasty collapsed before the top level could be completed. But even in its incomplete state, it was a monument to something, a statement, a connection point between Earth and whatever came from above. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We need to go back. Back to those first generations. Back to when Eridu was the only city. When the concept of kingship was new. When the boundary between gods and humans hadn't fully solidified into the theological frameworks that would come later. This is when, according to the Sumerian King List, it all began. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king and ruled for 28,800 years. 28,800 years. The number sits there on the clay, carved with the same confidence and precision the scribes used for every other piece of data. Not approximately, not symbolically. The scribes used their sophisticated base 60 system to express this with mathematical exactness. 480 Shah, a Shah being 3,600 years. The calculation is clear, the number is specific, and it's impossibly absurdly long. Alulim, the first king. What was he? Who was he? The Sumerian King List offers no details, just his name, the city he ruled, and the staggering length of his reign. After him came Al-Aljar, who ruled for 36,000 years. Then kingship moved to Bad Tibira, where 3 kings ruled for a combined 108,000 years. Then Larak, where Ensipasiana ruled for 28,800 years. Then Sippar, where Meduranki ruled for 21,000 years. And finally Shuruppak, where Ubortutu ruled for 18,600 years, 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years. And then, the text says simply, the flood swept over. That line, that single phrase, creates a before and after in the Sumerian worldview. Everything that came before the flood was different, special, operating under different rules, and everything that came after was diminished somehow, shortened, brought down to a more human scale. The kings who ruled after the flood still had impossibly long reigns by modern standards. The first dynasty of Kish lists rulers with reigns of 1200, 900, 600 years, but compared to what came before, these seem almost reasonable. The pattern is striking. From the flood forward, the reign lengths gradually decrease with each successive generation. By the time we get to the city of Uruk, Around 2700 BC, we find King Gilgamesh listed with a reign of 126 years. Still longer than a normal human lifespan, but within the realm of exaggeration rather than cosmic impossibility. And by the time the list reaches the historical period, the period we can verify through other sources, the reign lengths match what we know from archaeology. Real kings, real dates, real history. It's as if the king list is documenting a transition, a slow descent from something other, something operating on a different timescale entirely, down into the merely human. And modern scholarship struggles with what to do with this. The academic consensus is clear. The antediluvian section, those 8 kings before the flood, that's myth. Symbolic. A political document created in the early 2nd millennium BC to legitimize the ruling dynasties by connecting them to a divine primordial past. The impossibly long reigns are metaphors for an idealized golden age. Or their corrupted numbers, perhaps base 60 figures mistakenly interpreted as base 10, or vice versa. Or they're simply fabrications designed to make Sumerian civilization seem impossibly ancient and therefore more legitimate than rival cultures. All of these explanations are reasonable, scholarly, based on what we understand about ancient Near Eastern political propaganda and how rulers used the past to justify their present power. The Weld-Blundell Prism, that 8-inch clay artefact in Oxford, was probably created during the reign of the Isin dynasty as part of their claim to be the rightful inheritors of Sumerian authority after the fall of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. By presenting kingship as a single transferable divine institution that moved from city to city throughout history, and by tracing that institution back to the very beginning of time itself, they were making a political argument. We are the legitimate rulers because we are part of an unbroken chain stretching back to when the gods themselves first established kingship on Earth. But if that's all it was, why these specific numbers? Why not just say very long ago, or in the time of the gods? Why calculate with such precision that Alulim ruled exactly 28,800 years? Why maintain these specific figures across multiple copies of the King List found in different cities created over several centuries? There's a consistency here that suggests something more than just invented mythology. Some scholars have proposed that the numbers represent something else, not actual years, but some other unit of measurement that we've lost the key to understanding. Perhaps they represent months rather than years, which would reduce Alulim's reign to about 2,400 years. Still impossible, but at least less cosmically absurd. Perhaps they represent generations, with each generation being a standard length that we no longer know how to calculate. Perhaps they're astronomical cycles encoding information about the movements of planets or stars that had significance we can't recover. And then there's the theory that draws the most attention and the most criticism in fringe circles and alternative history. The theory that the numbers are real, that these 8 kings were not human, that they were the Anunnaki, and that they ruled from 5400 BC, when Eridu was founded, until the Great Flood ended their reign, whenever that was. That the Sumerian King List isn't mythology at all, it's documentation. A preserved record of something that actually happened, translated into the only language available to the ancient scribes who encountered it. We'll return to that theory. But first, we need to understand who these beings were in Sumerian thought. What did the word Anunnaki actually mean? How did the Sumerians themselves conceive of these entities? Because here's the thing that often gets lost in modern speculation. The Anunnaki weren't invented by 20th century alternative theorists. They're right there in the oldest texts we have, mentioned hundreds of times, described in detail, given specific roles, specific personalities, specific genealogies. They were real to the people who wrote about them. The question isn't whether the Anunnaki existed in Sumerian religion. They absolutely did. The question is what they were. The word itself is Sumerian, Anuna, or in Akkadian, Anunnaki. The etymology is fairly straightforward. It comes from the words An and Ki, and meaning heaven or sky, and also the name of the supreme sky god. Ki meaning earth, and also the name of the earth goddess. So Anuna, the Anunnaki, means something like princely offspring or children of heaven and earth, the divine descendants of the primordial couple. In the earliest Sumerian texts we have, from around 2100 BC, during the 3rd dynasty of Ur, the term Anunnaki refers to a group of powerful deities, the council of gods who made decisions about the fate of humanity. They are not a small, defined group with a fixed number. Sometimes texts refer to 7 Anunnaki, sometimes 50, sometimes 360. The number seems to shift depending on context and which aspect of the divine assembly is being invoked. But there's a core group that appears consistently: An, the sky god, chief of the pantheon; Enlil, god of wind and storms, often described as the executive authority, the one who enforces divine law; Enki, god of fresh water, wisdom and magic, the creator and protector of humanity; Ninhursag, the mother goddess, goddess of fertility and childbirth; Nanna, the moon god; Utu, the sun god; and Inanna, the goddess of love, war and political power. These 7 are often called the great gods, the ones who decree fates, and below them a vast hierarchy of lesser deities, each with their own domains, their own cities, their own temples and priesthoods. The Sumerian pantheon was complex, sophisticated, carefully organised. It mirrored the political structure of Sumerian civilization itself, with its competing city-states, its councils and assemblies, its bureaucracy and hierarchy. In Sumerian thought, the Anunnaki were very much like humans. They had bodies, they needed to eat and drink, they could be injured, they could, in some texts, even die, though their deaths were different from human deaths, more like a change of state than a permanent ending. They had personalities. Enlil was stern, authoritarian, quick to anger. Enki was clever, sometimes mischievous, always scheming to find loopholes in his brother's decrees. Inanna was ambitious, passionate, dangerous. Nanna was steady, measured, reliable. They also had very human conflicts. The Anunnaki fought with each other, politically, militarily, romantically. The myths are full of divine drama. Inanna's attempt to take over the underworld from her sister Ereshkigal, Enki getting drunk and giving away the me, the divine powers that govern civilization, to Inanna. The assembly of gods decreeing that Gilgamesh's friend Enki-Aidu must die as punishment for killing the bull of heaven, and the gods arguing among themselves about whether the punishment was fair. In one particularly telling myth, the Atrahasis, we learn why humans exist at all. The story begins with the Anunnaki divided into 2 groups: the greater gods, the decision-makers, and the lesser gods, the Agigi, who were assigned all the hard labour, digging irrigation canals, building cities, mining resources. For what the text describes as thousands of years, the Agigi did this work, until one day they had enough. They burned their tools, they marched on Enlil's temple, they went on strike. The greater gods are in crisis, the work needs to be done, but they can't force the Agigi to go back to it without risking outright rebellion. So Enki proposes a solution: create a new Bidyu being, take the clay of the earth and mix it with the blood and essence of a slain god. Specifically one of the Agigi who had intelligence, who had the divine spark. Use that mixture to create a hybrid creature, something with just enough divine essence to be smart and capable but fundamentally mortal, fundamentally limited. A worker race, humans. The goddess Ninhursag agrees to the plan. She takes the mixture and divides it into 14 portions, 7 males and 7 females. These are gestated in the wombs of birth goddesses, and after a specific time period the first humans are born. They're immediately put to work, taking over the labour that the Agigi had abandoned, digging the canals, working the fields, mining the gold. This story, the Atrahasis, is one of the most important myths in Mesopotamian literature. It provides the theological foundation for the Mesopotamian worldview. Humans weren't created out of love. We weren't created to worship or to grow, or to achieve some higher purpose. We were created to be useful, to work and to produce food and resources that would be offered to the gods through temple sacrifices. The entire economy of Mesopotamian civilization was built on this understanding. Temples were the centres of economic life because the gods needed to be fed. And feeding the gods, providing them with bread and beer and meat and incense, that was humanity's job, our reason for existing. It's a dark theology, honestly, more dystopian than most modern religions would be comfortable with. But it explains a lot about how Mesopotamian society functioned, why temples owned so much land, why priests wielded so much political power, why ordinary people spent so much of their labour supporting religious institutions. You weren't just paying taxes, you were fulfilling your species' purpose. You were doing the job you were literally designed to do. Now here's where the alternative interpretation gets interesting. If you take this myth at face value, if you read it not as theology but as history, then humans are genetically engineered. deliberately created by beings with advanced knowledge of genetics, with the ability to manipulate DNA to create hybrid species. And the reason for this creation is economic, resource extraction, specifically gold. Why gold? The Atrahasis doesn't explain. But another text, the Enki Enigma, suggests that gold was needed in the city of the gods, which some versions place in the sky, others place in a distant land. Gold was essential for something, important enough to justify the enormous project of creating an entirely new intelligent species just to mine it. This is where Zechariah Sitchin enters the picture. Sitchin, born in Azerbaijan in 1920, educated in Palestine and London, became fascinated with Sumerian texts. He taught himself to read cuneiform, though his translations would later be disputed by academic scholars. In 1976 he published The 12th Planet, the first in a series of books called The Earth Chronicles, and in it he proposed something radical. The Anunnaki weren't gods. They were aliens, physical beings from another planet. And everything the Sumerians described, the creation of humans, the mining of gold, the Great Flood, all of it was literal history, filtered through the limited vocabulary of ancient scribes who had no words for genetics or spacecraft or extraterrestrial civilizations. Sitchin's thesis can be summarized like this. There is a planet in our solar system that we haven't discovered yet. He called it Nibiru, though he also referred to it as the 12th planet, counting the sun and moon as celestial bodies. Nibiru has a highly elliptical orbit that takes approximately 300 years to complete. Most of the time, it's far beyond Pluto, cold and dark and invisible, but every 300 years, its orbit brings it swinging through the inner solar system, passing between Mars and Jupiter. Nibiru is inhabited by a technologically advanced humanoid species that the Sumerians knew as the Anunnaki. Around 450,000 years ago, Nibiru's atmosphere was failing, eroding away into space. The Anunnaki scientists determined that the only way to save their world was to create an atmospheric shield made of fine gold particles suspended in the upper atmosphere, reflecting and trapping heat. But Nibiru didn't have enough gold, so they launched a mission to find it. And they found it here, on Earth. Rich veins of gold, perfect for their needs, but requiring extensive mining to extract. The Anunnaki established bases. Their first settlement was, according to Sitchin, at Eridu. They began mining operations, primarily in Southeast Africa where the gold was most abundant. The mining was brutal work. After thousands of years, the worker Anunnaki, the ones actually doing the physical labour, went on strike. They refused to continue. The Anunnaki, leadership faced a crisis. They couldn't complete their mission without the gold, but they couldn't force their own people to continue the work. So Enki, the chief scientist, proposed the creation of humans. Using genetic engineering, he took a native hominid, probably Homo erectus, and hybridized it with Anunnaki DNA. The result was Homo sapiens, us, modern humans, created specifically to be workers, to take over the mining operations, to serve as a permanent workforce for the Anunnaki colonizers. For hundreds of thousands of years, according to Sitchin, this system continued. Humans mined gold, the Anunnaki governed. Civilization slowly developed under Anunnaki guidance. They taught humans agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, not out of benevolence, but because productive workers needed certain skills. As long as the gold flowed, the system worked. But tensions existed within the Anunnaki leadership, particularly between the brothers Enlil and Enki. Enlil viewed humans as tools, useful but ultimately disposable. When the human population began to grow and become noisy, disruptive, Enlil wanted to cull them, to reduce their numbers, to keep them manageable. Enki, by contrast, felt something like paternal attachment to his creation. He had designed them. He had given them the spark of intelligence, mixing his own divine essence into their di. He saw them as something more than just workers. This conflict came to a head around 13,000 years ago. The Anunnaki, with their advanced knowledge of celestial mechanics and their ability to monitor Earth from space, knew something that humans didn't. The next passage of Nibiru through the inner solar system would cause catastrophic gravitational disruption. Specifically, it would cause the massive Antarctic ice sheet to slip into the ocean, triggering a global flood of unprecedented scale. Enlil saw this as an opportunity. Let the flood happen. Let humanity be wiped out. Start over with a fresh, smaller, more manageable population. He called a council of the Anunnaki and made them swear an oath. They would not warn humans about the coming disaster. They would let nature take its course. All the Anunnaki leaders agreed, including, reluctantly, Enki. But Enki couldn't let it happen. On the eve of the flood, he went to the city of Shuruppak. There lived a man named Ziusudra in Sumerian, Utnapishtim in Akkadian, Atrahasis in another version, and Noah in the Hebrew Bible. Enki couldn't break his oath directly, so he did what he always did. He found a loophole. He stood outside Ziusudra's house and spoke to the reed wall, pretending he was talking to the house itself, not to the man inside. He described the coming flood. He gave detailed instructions on how to build a boat. He specified the dimensions, the materials, the need to bring aboard representatives of all living things. Ziusudra understood. He built the boat, and when the flood came, when the waters rose and covered the world and wiped out the vast majority of humanity, he and his family and the animals in his ark survived. After the waters receded, Enlil was furious to discover that humans still existed. But he was also pragmatic. The Anunnaki needed workers. The system required humans. So he accepted their survival, though humanity entered a new era. The age before the flood was over, the age after the flood began, and things would never be quite the same. In Sitchin's interpretation, this is what the Sumerian King List records. Those 8 antediluvian kings, those impossibly long reigns, those were Anunnaki leaders. Alulim wasn't human, he was an Anunnaki commander, and his reign of 28 to 800 years wasn't metaphorical. It was actual time, measured by a species that lived far longer than humans, possibly due to the different conditions on their home planet, or possibly due to advanced medical technology that could extend lifespan indefinitely. The flood serves as the dividing line. After it, the Anunnaki begin stepping back from direct rule. The post-flood kings have shorter reigns because they're hybrids, part human, part Anunnaki. Demigods in Greek terminology. Their lifespans are extended beyond normal human limits due to their partial Anunnaki genetics, but they're not fully Anunnaki, and with each generation as the bloodline gets more diluted, the reigns get shorter, until eventually kingship is fully transferred to purely human rulers with purely human lifespans. It's an extraordinary theory, comprehensive, dramatic, explaining everything from the origins of Sumerian civilization to the reason for gold's universal value across cultures to the recurring flood myths found in religions worldwide. It transforms ancient mythology into science fiction. Or rather, it claims that what we've been calling mythology was actually primitive humanity's attempt to document and understand a real, physical interaction with extraterrestrial intelligence. The academic community's response to Sitchin was swift and dismissive. Assyriologists, the scholars who specialize in ancient Mesopotamian languages and cultures, tore his work apart. His translations were wrong, they said. Fundamentally, embarrassingly wrong. He didn't understand the grammar of Sumerian. He mistranslated common words. He took phrases out of context. He imposed modern technological concepts onto texts that were clearly religious and poetic, not technical manuals. The word Nibiru, for instance, doesn't mean planet. In Babylonian astronomy, Nibiru refers to a crossing point in the sky, a ford, a ferry, a place of transition. Sometimes it refers to the planet Jupiter in its role as a celestial regulator. Sometimes it refers to a specific point on the ecliptic, but there's no ancient text that describes it as a planet with a 300-year orbit. That's entirely Sitchin's invention. Similarly, the translation of Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came is creative but not accurate. The actual meaning is closer to princely offspring or descendants of An. There's no verb of motion in the name. They are not defined by having come from somewhere. They are defined by their parentage, by being the children of the sky god An. As for the creation of humans, the Atrahasis and other creation myths describe a religious ritual, not a genetic engineering project. Yes, they mix clay with divine blood, but clay in Mesopotamian thought represents the physical material of the body, and divine blood represents the animating spirit, the intelligence, the life force. It's a poetic way of saying that humans are made from earthly material but contain a spark of divine consciousness. That's theology, not biotechnology. The scholarly consensus is clear. Sitchin's work is pseudo-archaeology. Well-intentioned, perhaps. Imaginative, certainly. But not based on accurate translation or historical methodology. His books belong in the fiction section, not the history section. And the continued popularity of his ideas, the way they've been incorporated into conspiracy theories and alternative history narratives, actually does harm by spreading misinformation about what ancient texts actually say. But dismissing Sitchin doesn't answer the underlying questions. It doesn't explain why the Sumerian King List records those specific numbers with such precision. It doesn't explain how Sumerian civilization emerged so suddenly, so fully formed, around 3500 BC. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, law, all appearing within a few centuries in a region that had been inhabited by simple farming communities just a short time before. It doesn't explain the universal human fascination with gold, a metal that's actually not particularly useful for primitive technology. It's too soft to make good tools, it doesn't hold an edge, but every culture, independently, decided it was precious. And it doesn't explain why flood myths are so universal, not just in Mesopotamia but globally. The Hebrews had Noah, the Greeks had Deucalion, the Hindus had Manu. The Maya had their own flood survivor. There are hundreds of these stories scattered across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. Is it all just coincidence? Are these independent responses to local flooding events that got mythologized into global catastrophes? Or is there some kind of shared human memory, some trauma so deep that it got embedded into cultural DNA worldwide? The truth is, we don't know, not definitively. The Sumerian King List remains one of the most puzzling documents ever discovered. Mainstream scholarship has explanations that are reasonable, evidence-based, grounded in what we understand about ancient politics and propaganda. Alternative theories have explanations that are dramatic, comprehensive, but requiring us to completely revise our understanding of human history and our place in the cosmos. Maybe both sides are partially right. Maybe the King List is political propaganda that drew on older myths and legends that contained fragments of real events we can no longer fully reconstruct. Maybe something did happen at Eridu and the other antediluvian cities. Maybe there were rulers, human or otherwise, who seemed to live impossibly long to the people who remembered them. Maybe the flood was real, a genuine catastrophe that reset civilization and forced survivors to rebuild from fragments of lost knowledge. Or maybe it's all exactly what mainstream scholars say: mythology, religious literature, invented traditions designed to serve political purposes, beautiful, sophisticated, meaningful, but not literally true in any historical sense. We're left with the clay itself, 8 inches of baked earth covered in tiny wedge-shaped impressions. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king and ruled for 2800 years. The prism doesn't explain, it just records, and 4,000 years later we're still trying to understand what it means. Let's step away from the theories for a moment, away from the debates about aliens and genetics and planetary orbits. Let's go back to the cities themselves, to the physical reality of what the Sumerians built. Because whether the Anunnaki were gods or aliens or mythologized human rulers, the civilization that emerged in ancient Mesopotamia was real. The clay tablets are real, the ziggurats are real, the canals and city walls and temples are real. And they tell their own story about what happened during those formative centuries when human civilization was being invented. Eridu, as we discussed, was first, founded around 5400 BC on virgin sand. But it didn't stay alone for long. Within a few centuries other settlements appeared. Bad Tibira, about 40 kilometres northeast, Larak, whose exact location we're still not entirely sure of, Sippar in the north, near what would later become Babylon, and Shuruppak, which archaeology has identified as Tel Farah, about 100 kilometres northwest of Eridu. These were the 5 antediluvian cities mentioned in the King List, the 5 places where kingship resided before the flood. And archaeology confirms that all 5 were real, inhabited during the period the texts describe, though the exact founding dates and sequence of development is harder to pin down than the texts suggest. Cities in ancient Mesopotamia didn't develop in isolation. They influenced each other, traded with each other, competed with each other. The King List presents them as a succession, with kingship moving from one to the next. But the reality was probably more complex. Multiple cities exercising power simultaneously. Political control shifting based on military strength, economic power and strategic alliances rather than divine decree. Still, the pattern is striking. These early cities, the ones that emerged during the Ubish period between 5400 and 3800 BC, they shared certain characteristics. each one built around a temple. Each temple dedicated to a specific deity from the Anunnaki pantheon. Eridu belonged to Enki. Bad Tibira belonged to Dumuzi, the shepherd god. Sipar belonged to Utu, the sun god. The temple was the centre, the nucleus around which everything else organised, and the temples kept getting rebuilt. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of Mesopotamian archaeology. At Eridu alone, they found 18 levels of temples, one built on top of the ruins of the previous one, each one larger and more sophisticated than the last. It's like watching a technology tree in real time. The first temple was a simple one-room structure, just a place to house a cult statue and make offerings. But by level 6, around 4500 BC, they were building complex structures with multiple rooms, courtyards, elaborate decorations. And it's not just getting bigger, it's getting more sophisticated architecturally. They're learning how to build stronger walls, how to create more impressive spaces, how to incorporate decorative elements like cone mosaics, where thousands of coloured clay cones are pressed into the walls to create geometric patterns. By the time we reach the Uruk period, around 300 BC, Mesopotamian architects are constructing massive temple complexes that wouldn't be out of place in any major city today. The Uruk period is when everything accelerates. Uruk itself, about 60 kilometres northwest of Eridu, explodes from a large village into the first true megacity. At its peak around 3000 BC, Uruk covered 6 square kilometres and housed somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's larger than many modern cities. And this is happening in 3000 BC, millennia before Rome, before Athens, before anything in China or India or the Americas. What enabled this? What allowed human beings to suddenly start living in such high densities? The answer is complex, but it comes down to a few key innovations. First, irrigation. The Mesopotamians became masters of water management. They built complex networks of canals and dikes, channeling the floods from the Tigris and Euphrates into controlled irrigation systems that could water vast fields. This dramatically increased agricultural productivity. One farmer could produce enough food to support not just his family but multiple other families, which meant not everyone needed to be farmers. You could have full-time craftspeople, full-time priests, full-time administrators, full-time soldiers. Specialization became possible, and with specialization came unprecedented social complexity. Second, writing. The Sumerians invented writing around 3400 BC, during the height of the Uruk period. It started as a simple accounting system. Picture signs representing objects. A drawing of a sheep meant sheep, a drawing of a jar meant grain. But it quickly evolved. They developed phonetic elements, allowing them to write sounds rather than just objects. They standardized the signs into cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script created by pressing a reed stylus into soft clay. And suddenly, information could be stored permanently. Records could be kept. Treaties could be written. Literature could be composed. Knowledge could be transmitted across generations without degradation or distortion. The earliest tablets we have are administrative. Boring stuff. Lists of goods, records of transactions, temple inventories. But within a few centuries they were writing everything. Legal codes, medical textbooks, astronomical observations, mathematical problems, epic poetry, love songs, complaints about bad copper shipments. The Mesopotamians wrote everything down, and because they wrote on clay, which lasts essentially forever if it gets baked, we have hundreds of thousands of tablets surviving from ancient Sumer. More primary source material than we have from ancient Egypt, Greece and Rome combined. Third, social organisation. The Sumerians figured out how to organise large numbers of people into functional administrative units. They developed bureaucracy, hierarchies of authority, standardised weights and measures, legal codes defining crimes and punishments, temple priesthoods that managed both religious and economic functions, kings or lugals, which literally means big man, who wielded both military and religious authority. It wasn't a modern state exactly, but it was something unprecedented. A way of organising human society that could scale up to sizes never before possible. And all of this happened in the span of a few centuries. Between 3500 and 3000 BC, Mesopotamia transformed from a landscape of village farming communities into a civilization of cities, writing, social complexity, monumental architecture. It's one of the most rapid transformations in human history. And it's this suddenness that makes some people sceptical of purely indigenous development. How did they figure all this out so quickly? Where did the ideas come from? Who taught them? The mainstream answer is that they taught themselves. That necessity is the mother of invention. That when you have the right environmental conditions, rich soil, abundant water, and a growing population density forcing people to cooperate, human ingenuity will naturally produce these innovations. Writing develops because you need to keep track of increasingly complex economic transactions. Bureaucracy develops because you need to coordinate large numbers of people. Monumental architecture develops because you need to express social cohesion and religious devotion in a way that everyone can see and understand. The alternative answer is that they had help. That the sudden appearance of all these innovations, all at once in a relatively small geographic area, suggests knowledge transfer from an outside source. That the Anunnaki, whether you interpret them as gods or aliens or survivors from an earlier lost civilization, provided the blueprint, taught the techniques, gave humanity the jump-start that transformed us from scattered tribes into the first urban civilization. There's no way to prove it either way. What we can say is that the Sumerians themselves believed they had been taught. Their myths are full of stories about gods teaching humans, Enki teaching the arts of civilization, Inanna bringing the divine me from Eridu to Uruk, the seven sages, the Abgalu, who were said to have risen from the sea before the flood, and taught humanity writing, law, temple building, and all the useful arts. The Sumerians didn't think they invented civilization. They thought they learned it, that it was given to them by the Anunnaki. Whether that's literally true or whether it's a mythologized way of understanding their own creative process, we're left with the same concrete fact. Between 3500 and 3000 BC, everything changed. Permanently, civilization emerged, and once it started, it never stopped. The Sumerian template, the city-state organized around a temple, governed by a priest-king, managed through bureaucratic administration, this became the model. It spread north into Akkad, it spread south into the Persian Gulf, it influenced the emergence of civilization in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, eventually in every corner of the world. Now let's talk about what happened after the flood, because that's when the historical record starts to solidify. When myth begins its slow transition into something we can verify through multiple sources. The Sumerian King List says that after the flood swept over, kingship descended from heaven a second time. This time it went to the city of Kish, about 80 kilometers north of Uruk. The first dynasty of Kish lists 23 kings with a combined reign time of about 24,000 years. Still impossible, but dramatically reduced from the antediluvian period. And here's where it gets interesting. Some of these kings from Kish appear in other sources. We have seal impressions bearing their names. We have archaeological evidence of construction projects attributed to them. The line between myth and history is starting to blur. We can't verify that King Etana of Kish ruled for 160 years, but we can verify that there was a King Etana of Kish, and that he was a real historical figure who ruled sometime around 2600 BC. As we move further forward in time, the king list becomes more reliable. By the time we reach the first dynasty of Uruk, we're on solid historical ground. The 12th king of this dynasty was Gilgamesh, listed as ruling for 126 years. We know Gilgamesh was real. The epic bearing his name is literature, mythology, not a factual account. But he was a real king who ruled Uruk sometime around 2700 BC. We have administrative tablets from his reign. We have the walls he built, or rather, their ruins. And something fascinating happens in the text at this point. The impossibly long reigns are gone. Gilgamesh's successors have reigns of 30, 15, 9 years, normal human lifespans. The transition is complete, from cosmic time to human time, from Anunnaki rule to human rule, from myth to history. If we're trying to understand what the Sumerians believed happened during the 241-200 years of antediluvian rule, we have to piece it together from fragmentary myths and scattered references. The king list itself only gives names and numbers, but other texts fill in some details. The creation myth we discussed earlier, the Atrahasis, describes the creation of humans and the reason for it. The Eridu Genesis, another text, describes the establishment of kingship and the 5 antediluvian cities. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains the story of the flood and Utnapishtim's survival. From these and other sources, we can reconstruct something like a Sumerian meta-narrative. In the beginning, The Anunnaki ruled directly. They lived in the cities they founded. They walked amongst humans. Eridu was Enki's city. He lived there, in his temple the Iabzu, surrounded by the fresh water he controlled. When the Anunnaki needed something done, they had humans do it. Mining, agriculture, building projects. Humans were the workforce, but they were also, in a sense, the congregation. The purpose of human labour was to feed the gods through temple sacrifices. This was understood as a reciprocal relationship. The gods provided order, protection, agricultural fertility. Humans provided food, labour and worship. But tensions existed. The gods weren't unified. They had rivalries. They had different ideas about how humans should be treated. Enki the creator was protective. Enlil the authority was harsh. This tension plays out across multiple myths. In the flood story, it's Enlil who wants to destroy humanity, and Enki who saves them. In other stories, Enki repeatedly intervenes to protect humans from Enlil's wrath. It's almost like a good cop, bad cop dynamic. Except the bad cop really does want to kill you, and the good cop can only help through clever tricks and loopholes. The world before the flood was different than the world after. Longer lifespans, direct divine presence, a kind of golden age, but it was also a world of greater divine intervention. The gods could decide on a whim to destroy a city, to send plagues, to punish humanity for being too noisy or too numerous. Humans lived at the mercy of beings who were fundamentally more powerful, and whose motivations weren't always comprehensible. Then came the flood, a cataclysm so severe it destroyed almost everything. The cities were buried under mud and water. The vast majority of humanity perished. Only Ziusudra and those on his ark survived. When the waters receded, the world had to be rebuilt from scratch. But something had changed. The Anunnaki became more distant. They still existed, still held power, still received worship. But they didn't walk among humans the same way. The age of direct divine rule was over. Now humans would have human kings who claimed to rule by divine mandate, but who were fundamentally human. This is reflected in the King List. After the flood, reigns shorten. After a few generations, reigns shorten again. Eventually we reach normal human lifespans and verifiable history. It's as if the Sumerian scribes were documenting a slow withdrawal. The Anunnaki stepping back, humanity stepping forward. The end of one age and the beginning of another. Whether this reflects actual events or whether it's a theological framework for understanding the transition from prehistoric to historic times, it's a powerful narrative. It explains the existence of ruins and traditions that seemed impossibly old even to the Sumerians themselves. It explains why kingship had divine sanction. It explains why humans had to work so hard because that's what we were made for. And it explained the flood, the great rupture that divided the world before from the world after. Now, there is one more layer we need to explore. The cosmological layer. What did the Sumerians actually know about astronomy? Because if we're going to evaluate alternative theories about planet Nibiru and 300-year orbital periods, we need to understand what the Mesopotamians themselves said about the heavens. The answer is, they knew a lot. Mesopotamian astronomy was sophisticated. More sophisticated in some ways than Greek astronomy would be 2,000 years later. They kept meticulous records. They tracked the movements of planets with precision. They could predict eclipses. They developed mathematical models of celestial mechanics that worked, that made accurate predictions even if the underlying physics they imagined was wrong. The Babylonians, inheritors of Sumerian astronomical knowledge, used a base 60 mathematical system. This is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. It's a Babylonian legacy. And base 60 isn't arbitrary. It has advantages. It's divisible by many numbers. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. This makes fractions easier to work with than base 10. The Babylonians understood this and built their entire mathematical system around it. They also understood cycles. They knew that celestial events repeated in predictable patterns. The Saros cycle, we used to predict eclipses, was known to Babylonian astronomers. It's about 18 years and 11 days long, and after one Saros cycle, eclipses repeat in almost the same pattern. They tracked Venus's movements and realized it followed an 8-year cycle, appearing as both the morning star and evening star at different times. They knew Mars had a roughly 2-year cycle. Jupiter took about 12 years to complete its journey around the zodiac, and they embedded this knowledge into their mythology. The gods were associated with celestial bodies. Marduk was Jupiter, Ishtar was Venus, Shamash was the sun, Nana was the moon. When the planets moved in the sky, that was the gods moving. When planets appeared in certain constellations, that had divinatory significance. The movements of heaven and the politics of the divine realm were the same thing. This creates an interesting problem when we try to map Mesopotamian cosmology onto modern astronomy. The Mesopotamians didn't make a clear distinction between gods, celestial bodies, and horned astronomical concepts. Nibiru, for example, appears in their astronomical texts, but it's not described as a planet in the modern sense. It's described as a crossing point, a place where celestial paths intersect. Sometimes this seems to refer to Jupiter when it reaches the celestial equator. Sometimes it refers to a specific point on the ecliptic related to the spring equinox. Sometimes it's described as Marduk's star, the celestial manifestation of the god's power. Sitchin's interpretation of Nibiru as a physical planet with a 3,600-year orbit doesn't appear in any ancient text. That's his extrapolation based on the significance of the number 300 in Sumerian mathematics. A Shah is 3,600, and Shah also had associations with completeness, with cycles, with cosmic perfection. Sitchin argued that this must represent the orbital period of Nibiru, but that's speculative. The texts themselves never say this explicitly. Similarly, the idea that the Sumerians knew about all the planets in our solar system, including Uranus, Neptune and Pluto, which weren't discovered until the modern era, comes from a misinterpretation of cylinder seals and astronomical diagrams. There's a famous seal, VA243, that shows what some interpret as a sun surrounded by 11 dots. If you count the sun as a celestial body, that's 12 total, the 12 planets of Sitchin's theory. But scholars who specialise in ancient Mesopotamian art identify this as a star surrounded by other stars, possibly a sun with planets and moons in a symbolic rather than literal arrangement. It's not a scale model of the solar system, it's religious iconography. The Sumerians knew 5 planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the ones visible to the naked eye. They had names for them, they tracked their movements, they incorporated them into their mythology and their astrology. But there's no evidence they knew about outer planets, no evidence they understood heliocentrism. Their cosmology was geocentric, with the Earth at the centre and the heavens revolving around it. This doesn't mean their astronomy was primitive. It was incredibly sophisticated for naked eye observation, but it was limited by the technology available. Without telescopes, certain things are simply impossible to discover, and Mesopotamian texts show the expected limitations. They knew what could be seen, they didn't know what was beyond the visible horizon. So when we circle back to the question of what the Anunnaki were, we're left with a few possibilities. First, the mainstream view. The Anunnaki were gods, deities in a polytheistic religion, powerful, human-like, but fundamentally supernatural. The Sumerians believed in them the way Greeks believed in Zeus, or Egyptians believed in Ra. The stories about them are mythology, attempts to understand the world through narrative. The 200 years of rule are symbolic, a way of expressing the immeasurable antiquity of divine order, not meant to be taken literally. Second, the alternative view. The Anunnaki were aliens. Physical beings from another planet who came to Earth, genetically engineered humans, ruled over early civilization, and eventually left, though possibly still monitoring us from a distance. The 200 years are real time, measured in actual years or possibly in some other unit we don't understand. The myths are garbled history, ancient people trying to describe advanced technology using the only vocabulary they had. Third, a middle position. The Anunnaki were human, or at least terrestrial, but they were from an earlier, lost civilization, survivors of a cataclysm that destroyed a previous advanced culture. They possessed knowledge that seemed magical to Neolithic humans. They taught the Sumerians writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture. The stories about them got mythologized over generations, transformed from history into legend. The 200 years are either symbolic or represent some kind of institutional continuity rather than individual lifespans. Each of these interpretations has its advocates. Each has its problems. The mainstream view has the weight of scholarly consensus, but struggles to fully explain the sudden emergence of Sumerian civilization and the specificity of the numbers in the King List. The alien. View is comprehensive and dramatic but lacks physical evidence and relies on disputed translations. The lost civilization view is appealing as a compromise but faces its own challenges in terms of archaeological evidence for where this supposed earlier civilization existed. We're not going to solve this tonight. The mystery of the Sumerian King List has persisted for 4,000 years. It will persist long after we're gone. But perhaps that's part of its power. Perhaps the point isn't to solve it definitively, but to sit with the mystery, to let it exist as a question mark in our understanding of history. Because here's what we know for certain. Around 5400 BC, humans in southern Mesopotamia started building cities. They invented writing, they developed mathematics and astronomy, they created art, literature, law, they built ziggurats that touched the sky and dug canals that watered deserts. They gave us the foundation of civilization, the template that every culture since has followed or reacted against. And they left us records, clay tablets by the thousands, including one particular clay prism that says that before all of this began, before the cities and the writing and the kings, there was something else, something that lasted 200 years, 8 rulers in 5 cities, and then a flood, and then everything we call history. Whether those 8 rulers were gods or aliens or mythologized humans or something else entirely, they cast a long shadow, long enough to reach across 4 millennia and touch us here, tonight, as we lie in the dark wondering about our origins. Long enough to make us ask uncomfortable questions about what we think we know and what might be hidden in the gaps of the historical record. The Anunnaki, whether they existed or not, serve a function. They're a reminder that the story of humanity might be stranger than we imagine, that the official narrative might be incomplete, that there might be chapters missing, ages forgotten, truths buried under desert sand or locked in languages we can barely read. And maybe that's okay. Maybe certainty isn't what we need. Maybe the mystery is the gift. The invitation to keep looking, keep questioning, keep being curious about where we came from and what it all means. The desert wind still blows across southern Iraq. The ruins of Eridu still rise from the sand, weathered and broken but unmistakably there. The ziggurat that Enki's priests built 3,000 years ago still stands, at least partially, a testament to human ambition, or divine mandate, or something in between. And in Oxford, in a museum that most visitors rush through on their way to see more famous exhibits, there sits a clay prism, 8 inches tall, 4,000 years old, covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks, and on that prism, in a language almost no one speaks anymore, is a list. 8 names, 8 impossible numbers, and the simple statement that this is how it began. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alalim became king and ruled for 2800 years. The clay doesn't explain what it means, it just sits there, patient, waiting for us to figure it out, or waiting for us to accept that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only pondered, only carried with us, only passed down to the next generation who will look at those wedge-shaped marks and ask the same questions we're asking now. What were the Anunnaki? Who ruled for 200 years? What happened before the flood? And what truth is locked in these impossible numbers that the ancient scribes preserved with such care? The answers, if they exist, are buried, under sand, under time, under layer after layer of new construction, new civilizations, new stories we've told ourselves about who we are and where we came from. Maybe we'll uncover them someday. Maybe we never will. But the search itself, the act of looking, the willingness to sit with uncertainty and let ancient mysteries be mysterious, that might be enough. Your breathing has slowed now. Your thoughts are drifting. The weight of the day has lifted. The ancient world is fading back into the darkness where it's lived for thousands of years. Eridu is gone. The antediluvian cities are dust. The Anunnaki, whatever they were, have long since vanished from the earth. But the clay remains. The words remain. The questions remain. And somewhere in that space between knowing and not knowing, between history and myth, between the provable and the mysterious, there's a kind of peace, a recognition that we're part of something larger, a story that stretches back to the very beginning of recorded time and forward into an unknowable future. The flood came and went, civilizations rose and fell, kings ruled, their brief moments and returned to clay. The Anunnaki descended or didn't descend. Humans were created or evolved or both, and life continued, generation after generation, building on the ruins of what came before, creating new stories, new mysteries, new questions for future generations to puzzle over. Tonight, you're part of that story. Lying in the dark, listening to the words about words carved in clay about kings who may or may not have existed. Connecting, however briefly, with scribes who died 4,000 years ago but whose work survives, whose questions survive, whose mysteries survive. Before we let the ancient world fade completely, there's more to explore, more layers to peel back. Because the story of those 200 years isn't just about impossible numbers and unverifiable claims. It's about what those years meant to the people who recorded them, what they represented in terms of cultural memory, religious belief, and the human need to understand where we came from. Let's return to the 5 antediluvian cities one more time, not just as names in a list, but as real places where real people lived, worked, worshipped, and died. Each one has its own archaeological story, its own contribution to our understanding of early Mesopotamian civilization, and each one in its own way supports or challenges the narratives we've explored. Eridu we've discussed extensively, the first city, the place where kingship descended. But what about Bad Tibira, the second city listed in the King List, where 3 kings supposedly ruled for a combined 108,000 years? Bad Tibira has been tentatively identified with Tel al-Madain, about 40 kilometres northeast of Eridu. Excavations there have been limited, interrupted by political instability in the region, but what's been found is tantalising. Bad Tibira appears to have been a metalworking centre. The name itself possibly means fortress of the metalworkers. Tablets found at the site reference copper smelting and the manufacture of bronze tools. This is significant because metalworking was one of the technologies that defined the advancement of civilization. The ability to mine ore, smelt it, and forge tools and weapons gave societies enormous advantages. Control of metal resources meant power, and Bad Tibira, according to the texts, was where this knowledge was centralized. The god associated with Bad Tibira was Dumuzi, known to the Akkadians as Tammuz. He was a shepherd god, later incorporated into dying and rising god mythology that influenced cultures throughout the Near East. The worship of Dumuzi involved elaborate rituals of death and rebirth, symbolizing agricultural cycles, but his association with Bad Tibira suggests another layer. Perhaps he was also seen as a patron of craftsmen, of those who transformed raw materials into useful objects, just as he transformed death into rebirth. 3 kings ruled Bad Tibira according to the King List. Enmenluana, who ruled for 43,200 years, Enmengalana, who ruled for 28,800 years. And Dumuzi himself, the shepherd god, who ruled as king for 36,000 years. The inclusion of a god among human, or at least human-attributed rulers is noteworthy. It suggests that the boundary between divine and mortal kingship was fluid in Sumerian thought, or it suggests that what we call divine rulers were remembered as actual kings whose reigns seemed so long, so significant, that they took on divine characteristics in cultural memory. Larak, the 3rd antediluvian city, is even more mysterious. Its exact location remains uncertain, though it's been tentatively placed at Tel al-Wilaya near Kut al-Imara. Only one king is listed as ruling from Larak, En-Sipaziana, for 28,800 years. We know almost nothing else about this city. It appears in the King List and in a few other fragmentary texts, but it hasn't been extensively excavated. It sits there as a gap in our knowledge, a blank space on the map where a city that supposedly lasted tens of thousands of years should be. This is one of the frustrations of Mesopotamian archaeology. So much has been lost. Cities that were thriving metropolises 4,000 years ago are now tells, mounds of rubble buried under meters of sand. Many haven't been excavated. Many that have been excavated were done so in the early 20th century, using techniques that modern archaeologists would consider destructive and insufficient. Context was lost, small artefacts were discarded, and the political instability of the region has made systematic archaeological work nearly impossible for decades. So when we try to verify the claims of the King List, we're working with incomplete data. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found proof of 28,800-year reigns doesn't mean they didn't happen in some form. But neither does the absence of contradictory evidence prove they did happen. We're left with possibilities, not certainties. Sippar, the 4th antediluvian city, is better documented. It's been identified with Tel Abu Haba, about 20 miles southwest of modern Baghdad. Sippar was sacred to Utu, the sun god known as Shamash in Akkadian. The sun god was important throughout Mesopotamian history. He was associated with justice, with truth, with the light that reveals all things hidden. Judges appealed to Shamash. Travellers prayed to him for safe journeys. He saw everything from his position in the sky, and therefore knew all secrets. The king who ruled Sippar during the antediluvian age was Enmendur-Ena, who the King List credits with 21,000 years of rule. He's an interesting figure because he appears in other texts beyond the King List. The Sumerian text known as the Ballad of Early Rulers mentions him, and in later Babylonian tradition he's associated with divination and secret knowledge. Some texts identify him as the 7th antediluvian king, the 7th being a significant number in Mesopotamian numerology, often associated with completion and perfection. There's also a connection drawn between Enmendur-Ena and the biblical figure Enoch. Enoch was the 7th patriarch before the flood in the Hebrew tradition. Genesis describes him as having walked with God and then being taken up to heaven without dying. The Book of Enoch, an apocryphal text, expands on this, presenting Enoch as receiving divine knowledge about astronomy, calendar systems, and the secret workings of creation. The parallels are striking. 7th figure before the flood, associated with divine knowledge, taken up to heaven, or at least intimately connected with divine wisdom. Is this coincidence? Cultural borrowing? Or does it point to some shared tradition, some memory of an actual historical figure who was remembered across multiple cultures? We don't know, but the connection has been noted by scholars for over a century and remains one of the interesting puzzles in comparative mythology. Finally, we have Shuruppak, the 5th and final antediluvian city. It's been identified with Tel Farah, about 100 kilometres northwest of Eridu. Shuruppak is particularly important because this is where the flood story begins. The king who ruled there was Uber-Tutu, whose reign is listed at 18,600 years. And Uber-Tutu had a son who would survive the flood and become the most famous flood survivor in Mesopotamian tradition. That son's name in Sumerian was Ziusudra, meaning he who saw life or he who found life. In the Akkadian version of the story, he's called Utnapishtim. In the Atrahasis, he's called Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise, and in the Hebrew Bible, adapted and transformed, he becomes Noah. The flood narrative is one of the most significant stories in ancient literature. It appears in multiple Mesopotamian sources, each with slight variations but all following the same basic pattern. The gods decide to destroy humanity. One god, usually Enki, betrays the decision and warns his favourite human. The human builds a boat according to the specific divine instructions. The flood comes and wipes out all life except what's on the boat. After the waters recede, the survivor makes a sacrifice. The gods, who have been starving without human offerings, gather around the sacrifice, and a new covenant is established. Humanity will continue, but under new conditions. The most detailed version we have is Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is where Gilgamesh, searching for immortality, travels to the end of the world and meets Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted eternal life by the gods. Utnapishtim tells his story, how the god Ea, another name for Enki, came to his reed house and spoke to the wall, warning him about the coming deluge, how he built a massive cube-shaped boat, sealed with pitch and bitumen, how he loaded it with his family, craftsmen, and representatives of all living creatures, how the storm came with such violence that even the gods were terrified. The description of the flood is visceral. 6 days and 7 nights of continuous deluge. The world turned to clay. Everything flattened. When the storm finally passed, Utnapishtim looked out and wept at the devastation. The boat came to rest on Mount Nimush. He released a dove, which found no resting place and returned. He released a swallow, which also returned. Finally, he released a raven. The raven found food, found land, and didn't come back. Utnapishtim knew the waters had receded enough. He opened the boat, released the animals, and made a sacrifice to the gods. The gods gathered like flies around the sweet-smelling offering. They were hungry. They had been without worship, without offerings, for the entire duration of the flood. Enlil, who had instigated the destruction, arrived and was furious to see that humans had survived. But Ea defended his actions. Floods are not the solution, he argued. If the gods are as displeased with humanity, use more measured punishments, disease, famine, wild animals, but not complete annihilation. Grudgingly Enlil agreed, and as a reward for Utnapishtim's faithfulness, he granted him and his wife immortality. They were taken to live at the mouth of the rivers, in a distant paradise where they would remain forever. This story, preserved on clay tablets from around 1200 BC, but drawing on much older traditions, predates the biblical flood narrative by at least 500 years, possibly much longer. When George Smith translated this tablet at the British Museum in 1872, it caused a sensation. Here was proof that the Noah story, long considered unique to Hebrew scripture, was actually part of a broader Mesopotamian tradition. The parallels were too specific to be coincidence. The boat, the animals, the bird sent out to find land, the sacrifice, the divine covenant. It was clearly the same story, adapted and transformed by Hebrew scribes, but originating in Mesopotamia. This discovery launched a new era in biblical scholarship, the recognition that the Old Testament didn't exist in isolation, that it drew on, responded to, and transformed older Near Eastern traditions, and it raised profound questions about the historical basis of these myths. Was there a real flood? Not a global deluge that covered every mountain, which geology tells us didn't happen, at least not in human history, but a regional catastrophe so devastating that it seared itself into cultural memory. Archaeological evidence suggests there were significant flooding events in Mesopotamia. Leonard Woolley, excavating at in the 1920s, found an 8-foot layer of clean clay separating earlier archaeological levels from later ones. He interpreted this as evidence of the biblical flood. Though later analysis showed it was a local event, not a global one, multiple cities show evidence of destructive floods at various times in their history. The Tigris and Euphrates are unpredictable rivers. They flood violently. A particularly catastrophic flood could have destroyed multiple cities simultaneously, creating the impression to survivors that the entire world had been drowned. Or the flood could be a cultural memory of the end of the last ice age. Around 11,000 BC, as glaciers melted, sea levels rose dramatically. Coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years were inundated. In some places, the water rose slowly over centuries. In others, catastrophic events, ice dams breaking, triggered massive waves. Doggersland, the land that connected Britain to continental Europe, was submerged. The Black Sea, originally a freshwater lake, was suddenly flooded with salt water from the Mediterranean when rising sea levels breached the natural barrier at the Bosporus. This event, dated to around 5600 BC, would have been catastrophic for settlements around the lake's shores. If stories of these ancient inundations were passed down through oral tradition, getting compressed and mythologized over thousands of years, they could have merged into a single narrative of the Great Flood. A cultural memory of a time when the waters rose and the world as people knew it ended. But there's another interpretation, one more speculative, more controversial. What if the flood described in these myths wasn't water at all? What if it's a metaphor for something else? A catastrophe of a different kind? Some alternative researchers point to evidence of cosmic impacts during the Younger Dryas period, around 12 to 800 years ago. A comet breaking up in Earth's atmosphere and impacting across multiple continents simultaneously. The resulting fires, the injection of dust and debris into the atmosphere, the climatic chaos that followed. This event, if it happened as theorized, would have caused global devastation. Not a flood of water, but a flood of fire followed by a climatic winter. Survivors, trying to describe what they experienced, might have used the language of flooding because that was the most apocalyptic imagery they had. This theory is controversial. Mainstream geology doesn't fully accept the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, but it's being actively researched, and it provides an interesting alternative framework for understanding these ancient flood myths, not as memories of water-based catastrophes, but as memories of something else, something that affected the entire planet, something that would have seemed like the end of the world to anyone who lived through it. Whatever the flood was, whatever actually happened, it marks the end of the antediluvian age in Sumerian thought. Everything before it was different, longer, stranger, operating under different rules. Everything after it was diminished, brought down to a more human scale. The transition from those 200 years of Anunnaki rule to the merely human history that followed. And this brings us to perhaps the most interesting question of all. What did the Sumerians themselves actually believe about the King List? Did they take it literally? Did they believe that Alulim really ruled for 28,800 years? Or did they understand it as symbolic, as political propaganda, as mythology presented as history? We can't ask them directly. We can only infer from the texts they left behind. And those texts are ambiguous. The scribes who copied the King List treated it seriously. They preserved it carefully across generations. They incorporated it into their historical framework. When later kings wanted to legitimize their rule, they connected themselves to this lineage. They claimed to be part of an unbroken chain going back to when kingship first descended from heaven. But at the same time, the Sumerians weren't naive. They understood the difference between history and myth. They kept multiple kinds of records: administrative tablets that tracked real events in real time, year names that marked significant events in each king's reign. Archaeological evidence shows that they were meticulous record keepers when it came to practical matters. So they had to know that the antediluvian numbers didn't match reality as they experienced it. Perhaps they held both understandings simultaneously. The King List was mythologically true, expressing deep truths about the divine origins of kingship, even if it wasn't literally true in a historical sense. Similar to how modern people might understand biblical creation stories as theologically meaningful without requiring them to be scientifically accurate accounts of cosmology. Or perhaps they genuinely believed it. Perhaps to them the idea that the gods ruled directly in the distant past for impossibly long periods was no stranger than any other aspect of their religious worldview. They believed the gods lived in temples, ate the food offered to them, intervened in human affairs. Why wouldn't they believe that divine kings ruled for tens of thousands of years before the flood reset everything? The problem with trying to understand ancient belief is that we bring our modern assumptions to it. We assume that people in the past thought the way we think, that they made the same distinctions between myth and history, between literal and symbolic, between religion and reality. But those categories might not have meant the same thing to them. Reality might have been more fluid, more layered, more comfortable with apparent contradictions. In a worldview where gods and humans coexisted, where the divine realm and the earthly realm were intimately connected, where the movements of planets were the actions of gods and the weather was divine expression, the line between myth and history might not have been clear or important. Stories were true if they expressed truth about the nature of reality. Whether they were historically accurate in our sense might have been irrelevant. This is one of the great challenges in studying ancient cultures. We can translate their words, we can excavate their cities, we can handle the objects they made. But accessing their inner life, their actual beliefs and assumptions, that's much harder. We're always looking through our own cultural lens, always filtering their reality through our categories of thought. So when we ask whether this 241,200 years were real, we're perhaps asking the wrong question. The better question might be, what kind of reality did those numbers represent to the people who wrote them down and copied them for 2,000 years? What work were those numbers doing? What understanding of the world did they express? And this brings us back to the Anunnaki. Whatever they were, gods or aliens or memories of an earlier civilization or symbolic representations of natural forces, they served a function in Sumerian thought. They explained the world. They provided a framework for understanding why things are the way they are. Why humans have to work, why we die, why civilization exists, why there are kings, why disasters happen. The Anunnaki created order from chaos. They established the rules that govern reality. The me, those fundamental principles of civilization, were in their possession. When Inanna stole the me from Enki and brought them to Uruk, she wasn't just stealing abstract concepts. She was taking the actual power to make civilization function. Writing, law, priesthood, kingship, warfare, agriculture, all the technologies and social structures that make organized human life possible. These weren't human inventions in Sumerian thought. They were divine gifts, or divine technology, depending on how you interpret the myths. This idea that civilization was given rather than invented appears in cultures around the world. Egyptian legends speak of gods teaching humans. Greek myths attribute writing to Prometheus, fire to Cadmus. Mesoamerican traditions speak of Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan bringing knowledge from the gods. There's a pattern here, a widespread human intuition that our capabilities exceed what we should have figured out on our own, that we had help. That knowledge came from somewhere outside. maybe this reflects something real. Not necessarily aliens or gods in a literal sense, but perhaps a recognition that human progress isn't linear, that there are leaps, sudden advances that seem disproportionate to what came before. The invention of agriculture wasn't gradual. It happened relatively quickly in several places around the world during a narrow time window. Same with writing, same with metalworking. These transitions happened fast enough that people noticed. Fast enough to seem like they came from outside rather than developing organically from within. Or maybe it reflects something about how human society works. Knowledge gets accumulated over generations, but it also gets lost. Civilizations collapse, libraries burn, priesthoods that hold specialized knowledge get wiped out, and then later generations have to rediscover what was lost. When they do, when they encounter ancient ruins or old texts or fragments of forgotten knowledge, it seems like it came from the gods, because they can't conceive of their ancestors being capable of such things. This might explain why the Sumerians attributed civilization to the Anunnaki. They were surrounded by ruins of cities that seemed impossibly old. They had inherited a sophisticated cultural toolkit, writing and mathematics and astronomy that they couldn't imagine simple farmers inventing. So they created myths that explained it. The gods taught us. The gods gave us these tools, and before the gods stepped back, they ruled directly, for vast ages, for 200 years. Whether this is literally true, metaphorically true, or simply a sophisticated way of expressing historical and cultural truths we don't fully understand, it gave the Sumerians a coherent worldview. It explained their place in the cosmos. It justified their social structures. It provided meaning and continuity with an ancient past. And 4,000 years later, it still fascinates us, still makes us ask questions, still refuses to be completely explained away. The clay prism in Oxford isn't going to provide any new answers. It said everything it has to say. 8 names, 8 numbers, a simple statement about kingship descending from heaven, and then that devastating line. The flood swept over. But what the prism can do is remind us that history is deeper than we usually imagine. That human civilization has been accumulating, losing and rediscovering knowledge for far longer than we typically acknowledge. That the people who came before us were not primitive. They were sophisticated, observant, intelligent. They looked at the same sky we look at and asked the same questions we ask. Where do we come from? Why are we here? What does it all mean? Their answers were different from ours, shaped by their time, their culture, their limited technology, but they were genuine attempts to understand reality, to make sense of the human condition, to connect themselves to something larger and older than their individual lives. And in that sense, the Sumerian King List, with its impossible numbers and its antediluvian kings, is not so different from our modern attempts to understand human origins. We build evolutionary timelines and trace genetic ancestors and carbon date ancient remains. We create narratives about how we got here, where we came from, what makes us human. The Sumerians did the same thing with the tools they had, clay and cuneiform instead of DNA sequencing and radiocarbon dating. But the impulse was identical. The need to know, the need to connect, the need to understand our place in deep time. So perhaps we shouldn't ask whether the 200 years are real. Perhaps we should ask what truth they preserve, what understanding of the human story they embody, and whether that understanding, even filtered through myth and religious belief, contains insights we've lost in our modern, supposedly more scientific worldview. Maybe the Anunnaki aren't aliens or gods. Maybe they're us, our ancient ancestors, so distant in time that they seem like another species, so far removed that we've forgotten what they knew and what they accomplished, and the impossibly long reigns, the ages that stretch beyond comprehension. Maybe those are just the ancient world's way of saying what we say with our own chronologies. That human history is deep, that civilization is old, and that we've been here, building and creating and struggling and surviving, for far longer than any individual lifetime can comprehend. The flood swept over, and after the flood, everything changed. The old world ended. A new world began. This pattern repeats throughout history. Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge accumulates and disperses. The thread of continuity breaks and gets picked up again by new hands. We're those hands now, holding fragments of Sumerian knowledge, trying to read their writing, trying to understand their worldview, trying to connect their story to ours. And in doing so, we're doing exactly what they did, looking back into deep time, trying to understand what came before, trying to make sense of the vast sweep of human history that led to this moment. The King List begins with kingship descending from heaven, and it ends, thousands of years later, with historical kings we can verify. The entire document is a bridge, connecting the mythological past to the historical present, connecting the divine realm to the human realm, connecting what was to what is. And we, tonight, lying in the dark thinking about clay tablets and ancient cities and impossible numbers, we're part of that same bridge, connecting past to present, connecting the known to the unknown, connecting the questions the Sumerians asked to the questions we still ask. They wondered where they came from. So do we. They wondered who built the first cities. So do we. They wondered if the gods walked among them once. We wonder if we're alone in the universe. Different questions, perhaps, but rooted in the same deep human need to understand our origins and our place in something larger than ourselves. The prism sits in its case, the ruins sit in the sand, and the mystery sits between them. Patient, quiet, waiting for anyone who cares to listen, waiting to whisper its ancient questions into modern ears, reminding us that the story of humanity is longer and stranger than we typically remember, that there are depths we haven't plumbed, chapters we haven't read, mysteries we haven't solved, and maybe we never will solve them. Maybe that's okay. Maybe the mystery itself is the point. The invitation to keep wondering, keep questioning, keep looking back into the deep past and forward into the unknowable future. Keep connecting ourselves to the vast sweep of human time. Tonight you've carried a piece of that mystery. You've thought about Eridu and Alulim and the Anunnaki and the flood. You've held, however briefly, the weight of 200 years. You've wondered, as people have wondered for 4,000 years, what it all means. And now it's time to let it rest. Let the ancient world fade. Let the impossible numbers blur. Let the questions dissolve into the darkness. They'll still be there tomorrow. The mystery is patient. It's waited 4,000 years. It can wait another night. Your breathing is slow now, deep and even. Your thoughts are drifting like smoke. The urgency of understanding has faded. What's left is just the quiet presence of an ancient story, a whisper from the distant past, a reminder that you're connected to something vast and old. Let it be enough. Let the mystery be mysterious. Let the Anunnaki be whatever they were. Let the 200 years stretch out into incomprehensibility. Let it all fade. Rest now. Sleep. Dream of ancient cities if you want, or dream of nothing at all. The King List has done its work. It's connected you, however briefly, to the very beginning of recorded human history, to the moment when people first learned to write, when they first tried to document who they were and where they came from. That connection is enough. That thread, however thin, stretching from a scribe in ancient Larsa to you tonight, that's what matters, not whether the story is literally true, but that it exists, that it survived, that we can still read it, still wonder about it, still let it carry us back to a time when the world was young and everything was possible. The flood swept over, and after the flood, life continued. That's the real message, not the impossible rains or the cosmic catastrophe or the mysterious Anunnaki, but the simple fact that humans survive, we build, we create, we record, we remember, and we pass it on to the next generation. The Sumerians are gone, their cities are ruins, their language is dead, but their words survive, pressed into clay, waiting in museums, speaking across millennia to anyone who takes the time to listen. You listened tonight. You gave them your attention. You wondered about their story. And in doing so, you've kept something alive. You've maintained that thread of connection. You've honoured the mystery they left behind. Now let it go. Gently, gratefully. Let the ancient world return to its rest. Let the numbers fade. Let the theories quiet. Let sleep come. The prism waits in Oxford. The ruins wait in Iraq. The mystery waits in the space between knowing and not knowing. And you, having travelled briefly through that space, can rest now. Drift. Release. Let go. The past is patient. The future will come when it comes. For now, there's only this moment. This breath. This gentle descent into sleep. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is there, sleep well and dream deep. Good night.